are less than usual or less than the market rate. It could be anything, subsidized bank loans, subsidized insurance, or it could be things which are not explicitly shown as an expense or which is not even a cost. I will give an example of what could be those things. So this is best understood by an example. For example, government directs public sector banks to give cheap loans to street vendors. Now, this public sector banks, when they are operating optimally, they will never do these things because they know that the cost of giving loans to street vendors is more than the revenue that they expect. But on the direction of the government, they will undertake this activity, and this loss will be shown on the balance sheet of public sector banks, not in the balance sheet of government, that is budget. Now, when public sector banks run into losses, it is government's responsibility because government is the shareholder. So government indirectly loses there. So this is a kind of deficit that you actually, this is an expense that is not shown in budget, but it still is a deficit. So this is a very subtle difference of what we can call a quasi fiscal deficit. And one more thing that I would see, why are these? One has to understand why does actually government undertake these activities? These might not have output linkages, but they might have huge welfare linkages. So, for example, I will give another very example, which cannot be an explicit cost. Let's say take an example of Indian Railways, which is a huge employment generator, and it also runs trains in this country. So what happens is, uh, let's say there is always a guy on the signal who shows Hari Jhandi and red flag to trains. That is much more accurately done by computers today and much more efficiently, but still that employment, that person is there on the job, his or her marginal productivity is negligible, but still it is a cost to the railways. So this is also a kind of, this might not have output linkage, but it has a kind of welfare linkage. So this is a kind of quasi fiscal activity which Indian Railway has to undertake without any profitability in the return and losses. And this is not even shown on the balance sheet of railways as an expense. It is just there. So this is where what we can also call as a quasi fiscal deficit. And this is to
Kumar, you say railways are a departmental enterprise. Their expenditure and revenues are consolidated with the budget.
But somebody who is employed and his marginal productivity is zero, that is also implicit loss, but it is not on the balance sheet.
I agree. But if it is an arm of the budget of the government itself, it is not a entity which is separate from the government. So your earlier example of the street vendors is correct.
Okay.
If the railways was a public sector enterprise like the oil companies, then what you are saying is true. But it is a part of the government. It is a department of the government. So whatever it does, okay, either surplus or deficit, is automatically reflected in the government's finances. So this will not contribute to a quasi-fiscal deficit.
Okay, sir. Okay. Yes, Indian Railways was a okay, sir. Just the last point that I want to make, and this is said by Gavin and Perotti in one paragraph where they, I mean, it is said in a different way. And I read some Reserve Bank of India reports as well. What you call as quasi-fiscal activity is still a matter of controversy. I mean, there is not a very hard and fast separation. What are fiscal activities and what are quasi-fiscal activities? For example, I don't know if this is true. Central bank runs IGIDR. That is also a kind of fiscal activity. So, and it is funded by the government. So that will be, and it is not job of central bank to do fiscal activities. But so this could be a quasi fiscal activities as well.
Excellent. Excellent. You know, if IGIDR imposes large losses on the central bank, you know, so that will be added to the, should be added to the quasi fiscal deficit. That we are an insignificant part of the central bank is a different story.
Yes, sir. So this is, and there are, for example, central bank gives subsidized loans itself. So that is on the directions of government. So that is again a quasi fiscal activity, and deficit can be, but still there is no hard and fast
No,
rule.
no, but there is true that there is no hurry, but there are some activities which are recognized. For example, all foreign exchange operational losses, which can be pretty high. Okay, so suppose you have a mountain of foreign exchange. Okay, and what will cause a loss to the value of that?
Exchange rate fluctuations. I mean, if
No,
the
no,
price,
no. Which what fluctuations? Appreciation or depreciation?
if you have dollar reserves, then the value of dollar depreciates. Value of
So
dollar.
that so then what happens to the rupee? It appreciates. Correct.
Yeah, rupee appreciates.
So now consider this, that I have this mountain of dollars, and for some reason there is a huge rupee appreciation. Then what happens? There is a huge loss, no, to the
Yes,
central bank.
yes, yes,
Right, right.
yes,
And this may be done on the direction of the government. The government may feel that I want the dollar to appreciate for
yes,
whatever reason. We don't know, something. So this also then is a loss which has been incurred on the instructions of the government. So then there is a problem, no? Yeah.
yes.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Sir, that was all. I mean,
Yeah. So
okay,
so
thank you.
so now to make good these losses, does the central bank normally have to do? It will have to print more
Deficit
money, right?
financing. Yeah.
It will have to print more money. If it prints more money, there will be inflation. Okay. Okay. So everybody, you are very right, Kumar, that everybody recognizes that this quasi-fiscal story is very important. But there are huge difficulties in getting a precise empirical handle on them, even a conceptual handle on them. So generally, people like Gavin and Perotti recognize its importance in Latin America, right? And now you will see why they are talking about non-financial public sector enterprises so importantly. Because after all, this is a quasi-fiscal activity, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and for some reason, if these enterprises owned by the government get into huge losses, then who is left holding the can? It is the government. Okay, okay. So how this is to be accounted for is one problem. But conceptually, what are the activities that will be counted under this is another problem. Okay. And there are papers which actually give you methods to find out the quasi-fiscal deficit, but that's okay. Let's not get into that. So Gavin and Perotti don't use this. They point towards its importance, but ultimately don't estimate a quasi-fiscal deficit. Okay. So are there any questions on what we talked about yesterday? Okay. Okay, so this is where we had, oh, I have not shared the, just a minute. Sorry, I forgot to do the sharing. So this is where we had stopped. Okay, okay, and we had said that that if I run this particular regression of taking a fiscal variable and regressing it on a constant rate of growth of output and the rate of change in terms of trade, and I compare the standard deviation of the residuals country by country, variable by variable, and I found that and they find that the patterns are identical. This leads them to conclude that this suggests that the fiscal volatility that we observe is more than a passive response to macroeconomic uh, fluctuations. Now, remember, what are they doing? They are telling you upfront that there is more volatility in Latin America. Okay, then they are saying that, look here, if there is more volatility in Latin America in the underlying economic circumstances itself, this should be reflected in the greater volatility. But when they do this, they control for the greater volatility in the underlying real phenomena of output in terms of trade. Okay, and if you do that and you find the errors that are similar, patterns in the error, that is standard deviation in errors that are similar, okay, now how can you take the next step and come to this conclusion? Anybody wants to try? Or is it still not clear as to how this particular conclusion is arrived at?
Sir, I can try, but I'm not very sure of this.
Okay.
So basically what we are seeing here is that the underlying macroeconomic fluctuations in Latin America is much higher, right? Yet the residual volatility that remains after accounting for that looks similar both in the OECD countries and Latin America. That means it's
Correct.
the same underlying phenomena that's influencing both.
Perfect. Correct. You're on
Right?
the right track. This is excellent. You see, to the extent that fiscal policy is not passive but active in the advanced countries, right? Giving you counter-cyclical fiscal policy, blah, blah, blah. Okay. To the same extent, fiscal policy is a non-passive response in the Latin American countries. Because the errors are the same, and quite irrespective of the underlying fluctuations in real terms being much more in Latin America, the errors are the same. That means that discretionary policy or active policy is very much there in Latin America as it is there in the OECD countries. Do you see the point? Okay. Even though the coefficients of the regressions and all that will be different, but the errors are the same. The error patterns are the same.
Sir, just one observation to what Romit said. If something is affecting both causing both dependent and independent variable, isn't it a textbook case of endogeneity? And it is in the error.
What are you talking about in this?
I mean, I'm just reacting to Romit's explanation, if I have understood it correctly, or if I don't know if I have.
No, over here, the regressions are not run to show any causality or to show any influence. The regressions are run only to figure out whether fiscal policy is activist or not. So all you have to say is observe is more than a passive response. That is all.
Sir,
That is
can I
why,
say
wait a
something?
minute. Yeah. Just let me finish. That is why these regressions are not even reported in the full text. They're there in the appendix, if I'm not wrong. But okay, yes, tell me.
Sir, to what Shantanu asked, so this is a typical problem of an omitted variable bias. Basically, we haven't taken the fiscal policy into our regression because we want to see if there is something else other than the macroeconomic fluctuation. So, because there is a pattern in the errors, there it is clear that there is something else, and we are now claiming that something else is the active fiscal policy, right?
No, you're unnecessarily confusing issues.
Sir, here
Okay.
fiscal variables are dependent variables. So
Correct.
fiscal policy is very much there in the model.
That is right. So to the extent that you are responding to real output variability and to variability in terms of terms of trade, that's okay. Okay. But if there were great differences in the level of activism or the level of non-passive response, then the errors would have been very, very different, no? Which is not happening. And therefore, they are making a very, very, what shall I say, conservative statement, which says this suggests that fiscal volatility that we observe is more than a passive response to macroeconomic fluctuations. Okay, okay. So there is a lot of active fiscal policy being played out in these countries. That is what is being said. Nothing more, nothing less. Okay, okay. So this is the only point that they are making. So now, the next point that they make with some amount of detailed discussion is that the differences in the structure of lower levels of government are unlikely to explain the strikingly different macroeconomic features of fiscal policy between Latin America and industrial countries. Now, this becomes very important for them to completely deny the voracity effect or the flypaper effect. That is, for their basic story in the end to have real bite, okay, they need to show you very clearly that this voracity and flypaper story is not relevant in the current context. That is very, very important for them. Why that is important for them, we will come in the end. But currently, they take great pains in telling you that this voracity is not a story that is relevant. Now, and they go one step further, okay, to tell us that in fact, lower levels of government may have been more destabilizing in industrial countries, not in Latin America. Okay, this is another very, very surprising thing that they come up with their data. Now, how do they do that? So they show that the average own budget surplus, that is excluding net transfers of the central government of Latin American local governments, has been much smaller than in the industrialized countries. So what do? They have this consolidated data of subnational debts and local governments, and they start showing you basic averages of that. In both the regions, own deficit of local government has been fairly stable over time, and this is important. So have the own deficits of local governments been stable? The answer is yes. Own deficit means what? Expenditures minus own revenues. Okay, okay, not taking into account the transfers. So that is their own deficit. Because notice, if their own deficits become very large, the need to give them transfers will keep rising, right? So then this is going to compromise what the central government can do with its expenditures. Okay, okay, so that is not happening is what they are saying. That is, in both regions, the own deficit of local governments has been fairly stable. Hence, all the movements in the balances of central government that we have documented have been absorbed mainly by the central government. Okay, of the general government. General government means everybody added together. Okay, and central government means the central government. So all the movements are basically being influenced greatly by what happens to the central government. The average size of local governments measured by their own expenditure is much lower in Latin America than in the industrialized countries. That is 3.7 against 15.6 of GDP. Okay, there is much less devolution in Latin America than what you have in industrial countries. The ratio of own revenues to total revenues of the local government is much larger in Latin American countries than in. Now look at the difference, 81 to 54. So in Latin American countries, the local governments are much smaller. That's fine. But even these smaller local governments collect more of their own revenue, while the much larger local governments have large deficits. Okay. So that is their own revenues to total revenue are much lower than the Latin American countries. Okay. On average, the local governments in industrial economies seem to be responsible for a sizable part of large expansions. Now, what is a large expansion? It is an expansion is called a large expansion or a large contraction according to Gavin and Perotti if it is around 1.5% of increase in deficit of GDP of the deficit to GDP ratio. Okay, the contribution of Latin American local governments to these episodes of very fiscal, that is, increases in the deficit by at least 1.5%, by contrast, seems negligible. So, if anything, this flypaper effect may have been relevant, or voracity may have been relevant in the advanced countries. It is certainly not relevant in Latin America, is the point that they are trying to make. Okay. This statement holds whether one considers the deficit, total expenditure, or net transfers between the two levels of government. So, whichever way you want to look at it, in Latin America, the voracity or the flypaper effect is of no relevance, okay, or much less relevance. Though, you know, they have such a detailed discussion, they actually identify some episodes where this may not be true. So, those of you who are going, who I hope all of you read the paper, will recognize the extent to which they have an eye for detail. Okay, but generally, what they are saying, I mean, this particular statement holds true. Okay. Now, let's come to fiscal outcomes. The first thing that they say is that the volatility of fiscal outcomes in Latin America is striking. And the covariance is even more striking. Now, how do they go about convincing us about this? Now think about it. Let's just go back. Consider the Barrow tax smoothing model and our standard Keynesian prescriptions. Okay, according to Barrow, favorable shocks to the tax base, that is the doom period, should be accompanied by increase in the surplus and vice versa. Okay, and the Keynesian approach reached a broadly similar result by a different logic. Now, let's not go into the Keynesian logic. We all know that, you know, it's been talked about a great deal. Now, either approach suggests that surpluses should increase in good times and decline in bad times. This is, you know, you will see that the rational expectations and Keynesian story, at least on this aspect, suggests identical fiscal outcomes. Okay. Now, how do we go about seeing whether this is true or false or whatever? One is the method that Herkovitz uses, the alpha 1, alpha 2. But of course, this is a paper that was much before before Herkovitz. So they use a slightly different way, but you can see where Herkovitz also gets his ideas. Now think about it. So what do? So they say, regress the change in fiscal surplus measured as a share of GDP on the rate of growth of real GDP, the percentage change in terms of trade, and lagged fiscal surplus. Okay, and you will see that ultimately even Herkovitz basically used some variant of this regression. Okay. So you will see from where Herkovitz are getting their model, basically. Just a little more finesse on the empirical modeling of booms and busts, but this is basically it. Okay. So regress, the change in fiscal surplus measured as a share of GDP on the rate of growth of real GDP, the percentage change in terms of trade, and the lagged fiscal surplus. Okay, you understand? It's a very simple regression, right? Country by country, they're going to do this. Again, you will notice that Gavin and Perotti don't stack the data and treat it as a panel. Why? Because in 1997, and they wrote the paper a little before that, this panel data story was not really a big thing it had just started, but people were not doing these cross-country regressions using panel data techniques. Okay, so a majority of their paper is just country by country regressions. Okay, so this is a very simple regression that they run. Okay, which you will notice is quite similar to what Erkovitz and the Straczynski do. Okay. The coefficient of output growth is interpreted as the impact on fiscal outcomes of changes in real output. This represents the influence of both automatic stabilizers and any discretionary policy responses to output. Okay. The estimates suggest that in industrial countries, a 1 percentage point increase in the rate of growth is associated with an increase in fiscal surplus of about 0.37% of GDP. I will show you the results in a moment, but just. In Latin America, the fiscal response is negligible. That is not statistically significant. Okay, now. Let me show you the result. Okay. Where are we going? I went the wrong way. Yeah, here you are. Okay, so just look at the first two columns. Don't look at the good times, bad times. We have not discussed that yet. So you see, industrial economies, Latin America. Okay. So this has been treated as a panel. Huh? I am sorry. Up to now they had not treated it. Now they treated it as a panel because you see here dependent variables. So they give you the number of observations 314. So obviously they have stacked the data and at least done a pooled regression. Okay, yeah, this is a pooled regression. Okay, yeah. This is a pooled regression, right? No, they're country dummy variables. Yeah. So they have a fixed effects kind of a thing. Fine. So this is panel data. Okay, this is okay. All right. So look at the real GDP growth. 0.36 in industrial economies, 0.042 in Latin America. In one case, is highly significant. In the other case, is insignificant. Okay, and what is the dependent variable? Okay, cyclical properties of fiscal balance. That is the surplus or deficit. Okay, all right. So this weak relationship between the economy and the fiscal balance itself suggests a pro-cyclical discretionary fiscal policy response. For in the absence of such a response, the fiscal balance would naturally improve in good times and deteriorate in bad. You see the point being made. Now they are saying that in Latin America, you have a coefficient which is insignificant, which itself can be interpreted as saying this is pro-cyclical. Because if it were not so, in good times, you would naturally get the surplus to increase, no? Which is not happening. So the discretion is going the other way around, and that is why you are getting an insignificant coefficient. Okay, you agree? Simple. Okay. Now, in Latin America, there is also a much stronger relationship between fiscal surplus and subsequent changes in balance, implying that fiscal imbalance are less persistent compared to industrial countries. So what is this? If you can just go and see the coefficients here. So what is the coefficient of the lagged fiscal balance? Look at it in Latin America. Minus 0.29 and minus 0.174. Okay. So this is what is being pointed out here. Now, the contrast between Latin America and industrial countries is much sharper if we distinguish between good macroeconomic times and bad times. That is, now they are going to tell us what is a good time is a boom and a bad time is a recession. So bad times are defined as years during which a country's rate of real output growth is less than its average rate of output growth plus or minus one standard deviation. Okay. Think about what Herkovitz and others have done. Okay, and you will see to the extent that they have borrowed. It's the same, no, average and up and down. So it's basically the same idea that has been taken forward. Nothing new in that paper. If you have gone through Gavin and Perotti and then you read the cyclical ratcheting paper, you wonder, how the hell have these guys been placed in review of economics and statistics? Because almost everything that they do have a reflection in Gavin and Perotti in one way or another. Okay. All right. So these are good and bad times. Okay. Now, in industrial countries, there is a major asymmetry in the fiscal response to output shocks. During good times, the budget surplus increases by about 0.25% for every 1% increase in output growth. But during bad times, the fiscal response is much larger. A 1% decline in output growth is associated with a deficit increase of 1%. Again, the Herkovitz, these are nothing but alpha 1 and alpha 2. They are just not writing it that way. Okay. Now, this asymmetry is statistically significant at very high levels of confidence. So let me just again show you the results here. Look at this. Look at the industrial economies. Look at in good times and look at bad times. Okay, the coefficients themselves are very, very different. Okay, in terms of their magnitudes. Okay, and of course, these are good time and bad time dummies, B0 and B1. Okay, and you can see the difference, right? So you can set up a test and do that. And therefore, they are saying that this difference is significant at very high levels of confidence. Okay. Okay. It is consistent with the idea that recessions are economically and or politically more costly than booms, and that fiscal policy response to them are accordingly stronger. Okay, so this is only to be expected on Buchanan and Wagner. So we already know that this is going to happen. And does the data show that it happens? They say in the advanced countries, it shows that this is exactly what happens. No surprises. But shockingly, such an asymmetry does not appear in Latin America. Now, this is what is different about Latin America. Just it comes as a major surprise. In fact, the opposite is true. That is, the fiscal balance is less, not more sensitive to output fluctuations in bad times, but the difference is not statistically significant. Now, let me just again go to the paper to show you how they are, what they are saying. Now, look at the last column here, Latin America. Okay, and it is obvious that there is a negative sign on the coefficient. Okay, but that negative sign does not turn out to be significant, so you can't tell a very strong story about that. Okay, you can't tell a very strong story about that. But nevertheless, it is clear that that is, the fiscal balance is less, not more sensitive to output, but the difference is not statistically significant. But if one focuses on deep recessions, it becomes apparent. Now they're saying, this result is driven by the fact that we have defined bad times in a particular way. If we increase the nuance with which we identify deep recessions, the difference becomes very clear, and here it comes. Deep recessions are defined as episodes during which real GDP declined by more than 1.5% in industrial countries and by 4% in Latin America. And then they give you the count of these episodes. There are 13 such episodes in industrial countries and 18 such episodes of deep recessions. Notice that they are defining the recessions differently for the two sets of countries. Deep recessions. Why do you think they are doing that? Why can they not define deep recessions identically across the two data sets?
Different volatility
because
of growth.
output fluctuations are much higher in Latin America.
Correct. So, excellent. So if you are to identify deep recessions, then the nature of the data is such that you need to have different definitions. Okay. You see, every empirical exercise in which you have to create dummies to identify various things, it is not a trivial exercise. Okay, so they must have done this by huge number of trial and error and arrived at this 4% and this greater than 1.5% with a lot of effort. So there will be a lot of research assistants who will be doing a lot of data mining behind to ultimately for them to come to these two percentages, 1.5 and 4. Okay. During typical deep recessions, industrial country real GDP declines by 3.5% and the fiscal balance moves towards deficit by about 4.4%. Okay, so they run these regressions. I'm not showing you those regressions. I showed you one set of regressions, but these you need to go and see yourself. Okay. Now the punchline. In Latin America, the typical deep recession involves a decline in real GDP of more than 10%, while the fiscal balance has on average moved towards surplus by a full 2% of GDP. Now, for any person who has any idea about counter-cyclical fiscal policy, this will give you a huge amount of heartburn, if not a heart attack. Okay, so look at the extent of the output loss. 10%. And in the face of this 10% output loss and the concomitant employment loss, what happens to fiscal balance? It moves towards a surplus. Can you imagine? I mean, what the hell is happening here? None of your macroeconomic models that suggest either the Barrow tax smoothing type story or the Keynesian story cannot be vindicated by this. No, they are at complete odds. So it is a huge mystery now as to what the hell is happening in these Latin American countries. If when in deep recessions, the loss of output is so large, okay, and in the face of these large output losses in terms of during the recession, the budget balance, fiscal balance moved towards a surplus of around 2%. What is happening here? You know, so you see the puzzle. So this is a classic way of uncovering a puzzle in macroeconomics. You know, in both the areas of economics where I have some amount of interest, that is corporate finance and macroeconomics, puzzles are far more important in corporate finance, but puzzles are also important in macroeconomics. And this is a very typical example of how a puzzle has been uncovered from the data. That is, this is completely unexpected with absolutely no theoretical reasoning that can be supplied as to why such an outcome has happened. And why am I saying why no theoretical underpinning? Because remember, they have rejected the voracity effect out of hand, no? They have taken great pains to show you that voracity is not driving these results at all. So if voracity is thrown out of the window and you are getting this kind of pro-cyclicality, what the hell is driving it? Okay. So now you will notice that these fellows are really skilled macroeconomists. Okay. One, they have told you and increased your confidence in terms of the data that you are using, right? So you cannot fault them on being lackadaisical when it comes to data issues. Very careful data. Then they are negating a very important reason for pro-cyclicality, that is voracity, that is off the table. And then they are telling you a story that when I'm comparing the fiscal outcomes in Latin America and the advanced countries, I am getting dramatically different results. Just a minute. Hello, Martha. I am in class. I'm teaching. I'll call you after 2 o'clock. Or is it urgent? 2 o'clock is fine. No? Yeah. Excuse me. Sorry, that was Martha on the phone, so I had to respond. Okay. So they are showing you completely different results in the industrial countries and Latin America. Okay. Now I'll just wait here for a moment. Any of you want to comment on how they have come to up to this point in the paper? Anything that you find? Okay. What do you think? No
Sir, I
comments.
have a question.
Bolo.
Why was the fiscal policy so bizarre, so to say, in
That's
Latin?
the puzzle, no?
Yeah,
We
was
have
it due
not
to
said anything.
political back politics or something?
Hold on. That's where we are going, no? Ultimately, the paper will give you a reason as to why this is so. But notice, the most important reason in the literature at that time, the voracity, they have taken off the table. So they are going to say something else. So let it be a suspense as to what they are going to say. That is fine. But But I'm only asking you to respond to the steps they have taken in terms of their research methodology. May not be a good question, a good term to use, but how progressively they build up their argument and makes your heart stop when they come to their main empirical conclusion. That is, an output loss of 10% in a deep recession is associated with a movement of this of the budget balance to a surplus of around 2%. Now, this just does not make sense at all. Once you've removed the veracity story from the table, you just cannot figure out why this happens, because there is nothing in theory that will tell you why such an outcome is possible, and therefore it becomes a major puzzle. Okay, does anybody want to say anything, or I can go ahead? Okay, so let me go ahead. And of course, more importantly, the swing into surplus is statistically significant. So that has to hold. So I'm not purposely not showing you the empirics. You go and read them. I showed you the basic empirics, but this I'm not going to the paper. Now, so this is about the deficit and surplus. There is the primary deficit and surplus. So what about the cyclical behavior of expenditures and its components? Okay, and revenues and its components. The same regression you used with the dependent variable changed to the growth rates of expenditure and revenue. Okay, fiscal revenue increases in both countries in rough proportion to GDP growth. Some indications that revenue is more sensitive to economic fluctuations in Latin America. This is standard. No, those regressions are standard. So by what coefficients are they comparing to come at this conclusion is obvious. Okay. In industrial countries, total spending is approximately uncorrelated with output fluctuations, with slightly pro-cyclical government consumption being offset by counter-cyclical behavior of subsidies and transfers. Now, okay, this is very, very, very important. In industrial countries, total spending, that is total expenditure, is approximately uncorrelated with output fluctuations. Okay. With slightly pro-cyclical government consumption. Okay, being offset by counter-cyclical behavior of subsidies and transfers. So, in expenditures, the most important expenditure that has counter-cyclicality is subsidies and transfers. Okay, okay. And over here, then it becomes obvious as to what is driving the surplus and deficit results. What is driving the surplus and deficit results is the behavior of subsidies and transfers. Because in boom times, these subsidies and transfers drop, and in recession times, these subsidies and transfers rise. That is exactly what should happen, right? Because if potential output is greater than actual output, unemployment will be really, really very low. So you won't have to give unemployment benefits, etc., etc., etc. On the other side, when there is large unemployment and actual output is much lower than potential output, you would have to give a lot of employment benefits, right? So in the advanced countries, what is driving the counter-cyclicality of the deficits, okay, is Am I audible to everybody?
No, sir, you are not audible.
No,
Now
sir,
you are audible.
you weren't. For about 30-35 seconds.
Okay, I think there was some problem with my internet, I guess. I don't know. Okay. Because I started getting some beeping noises. Okay. So now am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Uh, Now I'm confused where I was.
Sir, subsidies and transfers, how they drive
We can't see your screen.
counter-cyclicity. So we can see.
We can see your screen, sir.
I can't. I don't know why. Okay, I'll check.
Okay, this is where we were, no? One focuses on these. Okay.
Yes.
Yes, okay. So, in Latin America, the typical deep recession involves a decline in real GDP of more than 10%, while the fiscal balance on average has moved towards surplus by a full 2% of GDP. Okay, can everybody hear me and my screen is visible to everybody, or is there a problem?
Yes, sir. You're audible and the screen is visible.
Okay. Now let's go ahead. So now, just look back at the paper and see how they have come to step by step to uncover a real macroeconomic puzzle. Okay. When I read it, I felt that it was really very skillfully done. Okay. Now, so this thing is statistically significant. This we have said. What about the behavior, expenditures and revenues? So this is where we were. Okay. The same regression is used with the dependent variable change to growth rates of, right? So fiscal revenue increases in both countries in rough proportion. This is also what we had said. In total spending is approximately uncorrelated. This is where we are ending, right? Okay, great. Now, it is thus the behavior of public spending, not revenue, that explains the more pronounced counter-cyclical behavior of the fiscal balance in industrial countries. Okay. Okay. You see this point? The counter-cyclical behavior is basically influenced by public spending and not the revenues. Okay. In Latin America, there is some evidence of asymmetric behavior in public spending. But rather than becoming counter-cyclical, public spending appears to become even more pro-cyclical during bad economic times. Now, this is another shocker. Okay. Now, the results on spending that you get with industrial economies are completely reversed in a very perverse way in Latin America. Okay. Recessions are thus associated with exaggerated collapses in public spending. Can you imagine that here your actual output is much lower than potential output and governments are reducing spending? That is exaggerated collapses in public spending. I mean, this is completely insane, right? In LA, expenditure and its components are highly pro-cyclical. This suggests that fiscal policy is related to policy responses, not the differences in relationship between revenue and the cycle. Okay. Now, in industrial countries, government consumption is moderately pro-cyclical in good times, while capital spending and transfers are roughly uncorrelated with economic fluctuation. So now they are going at the disaggregates. During bad time, government consumption and transfers are counter-cyclical. The deeper the recession, the higher the spending. This is in industrial countries. Obviously, I mean, the deeper the recession, that is more the output loss, the greater is the increases in spending. So that follows both Barrow and the Keynesian prescription. The inflation tax rate, defined as the inflation rate divided by 1 plus the inflation rate, this gives the percentage erosion of the real value of the nominal assets due to inflation in ICs, tends to increase when growth is rapid. Now, I don't want to get into this. This is a very, very simple calculation, right? Inflation divided by 1 plus inflation. Have you seen this before? A lot of people do this. Because this gives you the percentage of erosion of real value of nominal assets due to inflation. So that's the inflation tax. Okay. So this is standard. You've seen this before, right? The inflation tax. Am I audible to everybody?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So you are all familiar with this way of looking at inflation tax, right? Okay. In LA, inflation tends to accelerate when output growth is low. Now look at it. Exactly the opposite. So over there, when growth is rapid, you find inflation to be high. Over here, you find inflation to be high when growth is low. It's complete disaster. I mean, standard macroeconomic models cannot make sense of this empirics. Okay. In LA, where bad times are associated with a burst of high inflation that erodes real value of public spending commitments that are set in nominal terms. Now look at it. Not only are governments reducing spending in bad times, but there is high inflation in bad times. That means in real terms also the spending are much less. Okay, so step by step they are trying to convince you about the complete breakdown of stabilization policy in Latin America. Okay, that is actually fiscal policy is accentuating the business cycles. That is, when you are in a recession and in real terms you cut back on expenditure in a big way, what do you expect to happen to the recession? The recession is going to deepen, right? No. So having shown you all those very shocking outcomes for Latin America, now let us see what the reasons could be. The authors do not see the voracity effect as offering a good explanation for patterns of fiscal policy in Latin America. Why? We have already shown you why, right? Okay. Now, their view is that policymakers in LA have faced loss of confidence and thus intensified borrowing constraints in bad times. The loss of market access makes it impossible to run a counter-cyclical fiscal policy in bad times. So just carefully see what is being said. Policymakers in LA have faced loss of confidence. That is what? That is all those people worldwide who are going to lend to governments in Latin America refuse to lend to them in bad times and thus intensified borrowing constraints in bad times. the loss of market access makes it impossible to run a counter-cyclical fiscal policy in bad times. So, because governments are denied loans, if you are in a recession in Latin America, it is impossible for these countries to run counter-cyclical fiscal policy. Now you just step back and think about this a little. Running counter-cyclical fiscal policies involves borrowing, no? Because your deficits have to be funded. Is that right? And to fund those deficits, you will have to borrow. But if nobody lends to you, what are you going to do? Okay. So they are now pointing towards the financial system in the world that is providing, that is constraining these countries from running counter-cyclical policies. And they will go on to show that for the industrial countries, this is not true. Are you seeing where they are going? Now, policymakers might want to pursue a counter-cyclical policy during bad times, but are prevented from doing so because their inability to finance the implied fiscal deficits. Okay.
Sir, one question.
Yeah,
But when the times are good, what stops them from saving and getting it into surplus?
Buchanan and Wagner. Do you remember the paper? Have you read it?
Yes, sir. Asymmetry.
Yes, sir. Okay.
Surpluses have no friends. So why should that even thought come to you? Buchanan and Wagner have told you this is not happening. Okay. So it doesn't happen in advanced countries as well, but that does not prevent them from having counter-cyclical policies. That asymmetry is there in advanced countries as well, no? As we have just seen.
Yes, sir.
Correct. So that is fine. But over here, added to that is a question of market access. Okay, something happens to the market access of these governments when they are faced with an impending recession, that somehow people just refuse to lend to them. People means who we will see. But somehow there is somebody out there who lends to both these governments. So for the industrial countries, there is no problem in getting these loans. And for Latin America, they have a huge problem. That is what they are pointing to, right? But they will have to do a lot more work to tell us that this is empirically true, right? This is just a statement that they are making. They have not shown us any data that this is true and all that. No? That has yet to come. Okay, so you see the point up to now? All right. The evidence of such borrowing constraints are sought from data on the balance of payment statistics. So now they're going to the IMF for the balance of payment statistics. While borrowing constraints cannot be directly observed, their presence can be inferred by the use of emergency credit. Okay, now those fellows who have taken my corporate finance course will the first part, the first phrase, they will immediately appreciate that borrowing constraints cannot be directly observed. Okay, because we did a huge amount of work on how to identify these finance constraints, but you know that part. Now, while borrowing constraints cannot be directly observed, their presence can be inferred by the use of emergency credit. Now, in your BA days, you must have learned about the functioning of the IMF, no? You must have learned, right? or you don't remember? Nobody
Yes,
remembers?
sir, somewhat.
Somewhat, sir.
Okay. All right. So IMF credit, which is typically provided only when alternative sources have become scarce. That is, when a country gets into a balance of payments problem, okay, the IMF comes and says that I know that nobody else is going to lend to you, okay, but here I am willing to lend to you. So you have this credit window of the IMF, which is meant to help countries to whom nobody else will lend. We also have gone to them, right, in 1991. You remember? That you have to remember, right?
Yes, sir.
And the extraordinary credit provided by the IMF, which comprises arrears and special financing operations. Okay. So IMF comes along and says that, whatever arrears, let's carry them over. So don't pay us back just now if you have taken my loans from me earlier. And on top of that, I'm going to give you a special financing. Okay. So this is called the extraordinary credit window in bad times that the IMF provides to all member countries. Okay. Now, to see if such credit is associated with bad times, use of such credits as share of exports is regressed on country dummies, which takes a value 1 when that country is experiencing bad times. Okay. Do you see this regression? So emergency credit divided by exports is regressed on country dummies, which takes value 1 when that country is experiencing bad times. So there is a strong positive correlations between bad times and the use of such emergency financing, suggesting that bad times are in these times intensified borrowing constraint in LA and no such constraints in IC. So they show you that in bad times, industrial countries don't need to go to the IMF so much. Okay, but Latin Americans are forced to go to the IMF. Now, why is this the case? This is the case because all non-IMF source of funds are just off the table, while this is not the case for the industrial countries. Okay, there are international capital markets out there. So even if an industrial country is in a recession, everybody wants to lend to them. Doesn't matter. Okay, think about it. Everybody wants the IMF or in old times the German bonds or the American bonds. Okay, or now because of European Union, the EU central banks bonds or the bonds of governments which are floated by UK and Australia, and a lot of private investors will go and buy those bonds. No? Irrespective of whether that country is in a good time or a bad time, nobody cares. But suppose India has bonds, you think if we are getting into a recession, anybody is going to buy them? The same is true of Latin America. So all alternative sources of finance have dried up exactly at the time when you need them. And then what? Then you run to the IMF. Simple. Okay. Now, while this is true, the more important question to ask is there evidence that this borrowing constraint contribute to pro-cyclicality of fiscal policy in Latin America? Such borrowing constraints ultimately derive from investors' fears that a fiscal deficit will become unmanageable and lead to default. Okay. If they are an important explanation for pro-cyclicality, one would expect that countries with high initial deficits would display more pronounced pro-cyclicality than countries that enter a period with low fiscal deficits. Now, this statement has to be linked to one of those 4 papers, I don't remember which one now. That is, governments have a huge problem in figuring out how to come out of a fiscal expansion. Right? Everything depends on how you entered it, and this is the story. Okay. If you have a high initial deficit, you will have more pro-cyclicality because nobody will want to lend to you in any case. But if you have a low fiscal deficit to start with, people may want to lend to you. So how do you see this is true? That is, re-estimate the relationship between output growth, fiscal balance, allowing the relationship to differ depending on whether deficits were large, greater than 3% of deficit, or small in the preceding year. So that old regression that you had, you re-estimate it. Okay, depending on whether deficits were large, that is greater than 3% in the preceding year. So this is a very nice use of dummies that you will see that the paper will do based on this 3% story. Okay, in LA, countries that enter a year with low.
So I missed the previous slide. Actually, then my.
Can you see it now?
Yes, sir.
So the question is whether you are entering the deficit with a high initial deficit or a low initial deficit. Okay. So then they set up this dummy of greater than 3% of GDP. Now you will see, you will ask me where this 3% has come. That's very interesting, right? So what is the medium-term fiscal goal of the government of India for fiscal deficit? Anybody remembers? Chandra might have talked about this in your Indian economic class.
3%, right?
So this 3% is quite an amazing number, right? So why do you think 3? What is so great about this 3? Okay. But it just comes again and again in many fiscal policy studies. Yeah, 3% kidhar se, and I find it very intriguing. In country after country, somehow the 3% is okay. So in India also this 3% makes sense. Okay, just to reassure you that this is not coming out of the skies. So somebody will ask you, why this 3%? Okay, but there is a logic to this 3%, which seems to be there in somewhere. I don't know. If so many governments are saying this 3% story is good, then there must be something to it. Why not 2%? I cannot answer that, but okay. In LA countries that enter a year with low fiscal deficit, that is less than 3%, the fiscal balance responds to output shocks in a moderately countercyclical balance. Okay. However, in Latin America, countries that enter a period with high fiscal deficit, the fiscal balance responds negatively to output shock. So the initial deficit matters for Latin America. Okay. So they are saying that in Latin America, if you have an initial high fiscal deficit, you are a dead duck. There is nothing you can do. And fiscal balance responds negatively to output shocks. While it should respond positively, it responds negatively. Okay. In industrial countries, by contrast, there is essentially no evidence that initial deficit matters, suggesting that borrowing constraints have not been a factor. Now they say you run the same regressions for the industrial countries, and they show you that the initial deficit of the industrial countries is not an issue at all. Even if you enter a recession with high fiscal deficit, you still can respond countercyclically to output shocks. But strangely, the Latin American countries cannot. Another way of showing you that there is something going on here, which is different. Okay? And then they come to the main conclusion that the main reason for pro-cyclicality in Latin America is the loss of market access. Now, how do they show it? Okay. So this story does not end here. Okay, now think about it. What have they done? They have said that the pro-cyclicality of fiscal policy in Latin America is caused by a lack of market access, and this is a feature of the international financial architecture which discriminates against Latin America. Voracity effect is off the table. Okay. So this is a highly, strongly political paper. That is, the Latin Americans are getting together and now arguing with the advanced world that you have rigged the financial system in such a way that we are being discriminated against. So if you think about their empirics that they are showing you, this is discrimination, no? When you people have high initial deficits, you don't lose market access. You have no problems in running a counter-cyclical fiscal policy, even when you are entering a recession with a high fiscal deficit. While we have a problem here in Latin America. Okay, so the fault, dear Brutus, is in our stars. I mean, Shakespeare on his head. Okay, the original quote is, the fault, dear Brutus, is in our stars that we are underlings. But over here, why are we underlings? The fault is in the stars. Why? Because the world has created a international financial architecture which discriminates against Latin America. So,
Sir, I have a doubt on this.
Bolo.
Sir, people won't lend to you because you don't have any credibility. You have already spent too much at the cost of your credibility.
No, but the high initial deficit when it comes to industrial countries, they don't have a problem. So step by step, he has taken you through. He has done everything the same for advanced and Latin America, and shown you that the advanced countries are treated differently by capital markets, by international capital markets, and the international financial architecture itself is discriminatory against Latin America. This is the main story that they have built. Now, if this is the main story they have built, notice, then there is no need for any internal reform, this, that, and the other. No? So you have to put the international financial architecture right for these people to be able to run counter-cyclical policies. So in the international politics, therefore, this paper becomes a very, very, very important paper. Yeah, but what somebody has to say.
Sir, but this is very subjective. You are saying that people don't lend to you because they don't like you. So
this is very subjective means what?
Like in finance, there was something called finance constraints, because as you lose your credibility, your cost of capital increases. So they are also, because they don't have credibility, their cost of capital is higher than compared to very well established.
Wait, you're running away. You're running away. Hold on. See what they have done. They have said that when the advanced countries are in a similar position, that is, they are entering a recession with a high fiscal deficit, they don't get the treatment that we get when we are entering a recession with a high fiscal deficit. So they are comparing apples and apples and oranges and oranges. That is the claim that this paper makes. Whether we agree with it or not, whether it is correct or not, is a different story. I am only trying to put across the point that they are making. I have not said anything about whether I agree with it or disagree with it. So if we have to disagree with them, we have to completely understand what they are saying. And that is where I want to take you. The important point is not whether we agree or not. The important point is that we appreciate what they say. That is the first instance, that we should understand clearly what they are saying. Then we can come and try and see whether we agree with it or not, and things like that. So don't get into the problem of whether I agree with it or not. That is a separate issue. We will come to that. But you should have confidence that once you read the paper, that the main message of the paper is clearly understood. That is what my obsession is currently. Whether we agree, you, I, or anybody else agrees with their point of view is currently beside the point. So we need to take a view of the paper in the sense that how do they start, how they build their argument, and how do they deliver the blow, where the entire fault is dumped on the international financial architecture. You see, I said earlier that there is deep resentment in Latin America with the IMF, World Bank, and the entire international financial architecture. Why? Because a huge number of experiments were tried with them. No, so the fixed exchange rate karo. So one Argentinian lira is equal to $1. So you don't have any monetary policy at all. So this is just one experiment. Multiple such experiments have happened in Latin America across these countries. All kinds of things the IMF have made them do. Okay. So as a group, these countries had a huge resentment against the IMF because whatever solutions the IMF provide only made their conditions worse. The IMF conditionalities, this, that, and the other, were not able to solve their problems. Okay, and this is the first paper where systematically they are showing you how unfairly they have been treated. Okay. So that is the more important part. Not whether we agree with them or not. Of course, notice that one thing is never mentioned here, okay, which I find really problematic, is that the industrial world is 2 to 3 times richer, if not more, than the average Latin American country. Will that not be true?
Yes,
So
sir.
a richer person has more access to credit markets. That is a no-brainer, no?
So that is exactly what we learned in finance. Your higher initial capital means that you are facing perfect capital markets, and capital market imperfections only come when there are informational asymmetries, when you cannot convince credit markets that you are going to pay back.
Correct. But these people, Gavin and Perotti, do not point to the fact that in per capita terms, the advanced countries will be 4 or 5 times richer than them. Okay. That they don't say. So that apart. But that this is not such a perfect counter to what Gavin and Perotti are saying. But as we go on, we will see. Okay. So these are mota arguments which need much more nuance. But notice that at the turn of the century, Do you know which country was the richest country in the world? That is when 1800s ended and 1900s began, the turn of last century. Sorry.
United Kingdom.
No,
Argentina.
perfect. And why? Because at that time, later in the few years, people discovered refrigeration. Okay. And once refrigeration was invented, the best beef is available in Buenos Aires. You cannot get that taste anywhere else in the world. Okay. I can vouch for that. You know, the steak that you eat in Buenos Aires is just out of this world. I don't know what the cows eat out there, but it's really fantastic. Okay. So because of this agricultural commodity made them the richest country in the world. Okay, and then come the Second World Wars, the First and Second World Wars, this, that, and the other. After that, the refrigeration improves even further. They become even richer. Okay, and after the war ends, something happens. 60s, 70s, 80s, these countries enter phenomenal economic turmoil. Okay, so countries that were very rich fall by the wayside completely. And it is the Europeans, Japanese, Americans who become the richest people in the world. Okay, so you can understand where the resentment also comes from. Okay. So please read the paper. Okay, it's a wonderfully written piece. And systematically try and get arguments as to where you agree with them and you don't agree with them. Okay. So I think that ends my lecture for the day. Okay. Yeah. And please send me an email as to when you want the quiz, because you have to give me some time to set the quiz, right?
Yes, sir, we will do that. And what did you decide on the pattern of quiz?
No, I have not. But don't worry about that. कुछ तो करूंगा मैं. So give me a deadline and I will do it. Okay.
And set time, like for how many?
Half an
how
hour
many?
at best, at most half an hour.
Okay.
I'll try and set it up on Teams and let's see how it goes. Okay. So Thursday, let us see. Okay. ठीक है.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So thank you. I'll see
Thank
you
you,
on
sir.
Thursday. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.